Get started tonight. We're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 24 verses 1 through 9. Chapter 24 verses 1 through 9. But let's be honest, we're not going to make it to verse 9, so we're just going to see how far we can get. But before we can do that, we must do what we always do, back up, discuss what we talked about last week so that we keep everything in its proper context. Now, last week we covered Isaiah 23 verses 13 through 18. But it's really been the past couple of weeks, we've covered how the Phoenicians, that being the land of Tyre, how they were this main hub for trade and commerce. In the ancient world, it was the land of Tyre that supported all the other powerful lands around it. But the issue was that no one thanked God for that land. No one was praising God for this central hub that He had provided for them. And God was patient and patient and patient, and He showed grace and mercy to these nations. But they never thanked Him, for they mocked God by way of bringing in false idols, by way of not thanking Him, by way of praising themselves in all the work that they believed that they had accomplished to be so successful. So what happens? God's wrath is coming for them. And you think about that. Even today, we can relate to this. Every single one of us in here, believers, we know that we have been blessed by God. But there are times where we too neglect to thank God. We neglect to thank Him for the very jobs that we have, for the clothes that are on our backs, for the families that He has given us, for the roof over our head, for He is the one that is responsible for all of these things. And yet we take Him for granted even as believers. So now we're talking about this heathen land that has completely rejected God. So His wrath was coming for the land of Tyre. Now what's interesting, if you recall, that Tyre is on the west coast, and you have the land of Babylon all the way on the east coast. And through this vision that God has given Isaiah, He even warns Tyre again. That look, his wrath is coming, and you know that it's coming for you when you see the land of Babylon being destroyed. And God was going to raise up the Assyrian army to crush the empire known as Babylon. So you can picture here Isaiah prophesying, telling the people of this vision that first Babylon is going to be destroyed, then the land of Tyre. And do the Phoenicians, do they notice that Babylon is falling? Yes, they're going to notice it. But do they believe the words of Isaiah? The prophecy that God has given him? No. Not until it is too late. And for the land of Tyre, the Assyrian army was going to crush them as well. So we see the ways of God in which He raises up empires. But it's also God who decimates them. And you sit here and you're like, well, why would He do such a thing? I mean, this seems so arbitrary. But it's not. For these people wanted nothing to do with God after He has provided them with every single thing. So yes, His wrath was coming. And they, that being the land of Tyre, they were going to be wiped out for 70 years. Nothing was going to come from this land. Remember, this was the hub of trade and commerce. And for 70 years it was going to be silent. But God brings that land back. Brings back the land of Tyre. And you would sit and you would think, okay, so they've heard this. They've even heard that God is going to bring them back. So you would think this land, they would become followers of God, right? But that's not what happens. For they fall back into their own sinful ways. They don't thank God for rescuing them. Again, they look to themselves. The very pride that crushed them, they're falling back into that very sin. So you may be asking then, well then why would God do it? Why bring this land back if they're still going to reject him? Well, this was to show God's people that he was and always will be the sovereign one. For not a single thing happens without God decreeing it, and he decreed it before the foundation of the world. Sometimes his glory is demonstrated through his justice, and sometimes his glory is shown through his provision. For he raised Tyre back up so that they would be able to support God's own people in the land of Judah once again. Now let's jump into Isaiah chapter 24, starting at verse 1. Judgment on the whole earth. Behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make it desolate. Do we see the God that we serve? Do we grasp that it is the one and only God who spoke everything into existence? And when you think about that, you think about mankind, and we're on this rock that is hurling through space. And this rock that is hurling through space, it's not slinging us off. No, God has provided a way to keep us on this rock. But not only has he provided a way to keep us on this rock, he's provided all the necessities that we need. And if you think about it too long, it doesn't make any sense. How did he do all this? And he just spoke it into existence. But there's going to become a time when the sin of man is going to deserve the wrath of God. When his judgment is going to fall upon his creation. And why? Because the world has refused him. They deny him. They mock him. They come up with their own theories and how this world came into existence. And this is it, okay? It is absolutely brilliant. There was absolutely nothing. And then one day, nothing collides, and it brings about everything. That makes perfect sense. You take your iPhone, and you hand it to a 5-year-old. And you look at that 5-year-old. You know what that 5-year-old is thinking while they're holding that iPhone and they know how to use it better than you do? This was created. This wasn't nothing coming together. It was created. And yet here we are today with the great scientific minds claiming that all of this, including yourself, the universe that surrounds us, came from absolutely nothing. Now you think about just how patient God has been with us. But behold, the Lord will empty the earth and make it desolate. Just go to the first 3 chapters in Romans and you read it. And you see why we deserve God's wrath. Now, I believe that this judgment on the whole earth was actually speaking during the ancient times. And could we see this in the future? Absolutely, but I believe this is an ancient event that has taken place. Because we've talked about the east in the ancient times, in the ancient land, from the east to the west coast, how God's wrath is coming for them. And then we're just able to see it here as a whole. But notice what it says concerning his wrath. It says, and he will twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. Now, just in the book of Isaiah, we see this by way of the prophecy. Now, even though it hasn't happened yet, for them, it has taken place already. But you look at the amount of wars that were going to take place and the very armies that God was going to bring up to bring his justice upon the wicked. He is going to twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. But not only does he do it with the foreign armies that he brings up, the very heathens themselves, but he also does it by way of natural disasters. Earthquakes, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, landslides, wars. It will scatter the land of its inhabitants, making it seem as if everyone is gone. And this is God's doing. When a natural disaster takes place today, that's not Mother Nature. Mother Nature isn't angry. There's no such thing as Mother Nature. It is God's decree. But why? Why do these events happen? Why do wars take place? Why did it happen then? Church, we have to grasp the wickedness of man's sin. And how that very sin we commit against God, the same as they did in the ancient times, is spitting in the face of the Creator. That's one of the biggest issues today. When we sin, we don't see it as a big deal. But it is. Because we're disobeying the commands of God. We're saying that, look, we know that you created everything, but we're going to deny that. We know that because you gave us that law in our hearts. You've given us your commands throughout the Word. But we're going to tell you that's not good enough for us. We have our own commands that we would rather follow. And then we want to complain and whine when a natural disaster occurs. We want to complain and whine when a war takes place. We see how wars come about. It's God bringing judgment. We've been studying now for the past 5 or 6 months. What man wants to do in their natural fallen state, they're doing it then and we're still doing it today. We don't want to give credit to God for a single thing. We want to say, this is what I have done, this is what I have created. So yes, God has a right to be angry. God has a right for his wrath to fall upon the wicked. You look at the patience that God has with man. I mean, his grace and mercy is bestowed upon all creatures on this earth. They have food in their bellies, clothes on their back, a roof over their head for the most part. But do they give thanks to God? No. They give thanks to themselves. Look at verse 2. And it shall be, as with the people, so with the priest, as with the slave, so with his master, as with the maid, so with her mistress, as with the buyer, so with the seller, as with the leader, so with the borrower, as with the creditor, so with the debtor. Through this vision that God has given Isaiah, he was telling the people then that it doesn't matter the position you hold in your life. When God's wrath, when it comes for all the wicked, no matter what position you hold. For if your faith is not in God, then judgment is waiting for you. Now, for the saints of the Old Testament, this ancient land that we are talking about today, whose God's wrath, it's coming. For the saints in the Old Testament, their faith was in the one that God had promised. Their faith was in the one that God was going to send to rescue them. Now, for us today, our faith is in the one that God sent. That's where our faith lies, in Him and Him alone. And just like then, the same goes for us today. It does not matter the position you hold on this earth. That doesn't determine your salvation. It's where your faith lies. Because without faith in God, that means that your faith is truly in yourself. And why would you want to have faith in a sinner? Why would you want to have faith in one who is not covered in the righteousness of Christ? So just like then, when God's wrath came for them, so it stands today. You can be the President of the United States, or you can be a servant. But if your faith isn't in Christ and Him alone, you will stand before God and you will be condemned. Look at verse 3. It says, "The earth shall be utterly empty and utterly plundered, for the Lord has spoken this word." Again, during the ancient times, from the east to the west coast, from Babylon to Tyre, God's wrath was coming. And His wrath was coming because He had decreed it to take place. And look at the words. Empty and utterly plundered. Now, we said this earlier. We've seen throughout the book of Isaiah, the armies, when they attack, that they wipe out everything. So you can just picture the people here hearing about this, these very words coming from Isaiah's mouth. And what do? They reject it. So what does God do? He pours His wrath out upon them. And then they see exactly what Isaiah was talking about. That this land that God had given them, He takes it away from them. It's utterly empty and it's utterly plundered. And how does this happen? By God speaking the word. Now, this sounds horrible, doesn't it? It should. But why does this happen, church? Is it because the nations were bowing down before God, thanking Him for everything that He had given them? No. Were they praising God and just one day God was bored? It's like, I got to do something. Let's just destroy it all. No. Again, it goes back to the sins of man. We've got to grasp that. And why? Well, you're sitting here saying, but we're believers in here, and you're telling us that we have to grasp this? Do you not think understanding sin is going to help you go out into the world and disciple? When you understand what God's wrath can do, that it can leave these lands utterly desolate and plundered, and you've got loved ones out there that are rejecting God, is this not going to motivate you, knowing that his wrath, his judgment is coming again? It should. Look at verse 4. It says, the earth mourns and withers. The world languishes and withers. The highest people of the earth languish. And now what is this speaking of? This could very well mean that God is going to bring a drought upon the ancient lands during this time. And we take that for granted. They took it for granted. What do you do if God takes water away from you? I mean, he's the one that put it there. He's the one that makes it rain. And he can take that. Where do you think our food comes from? You have to have H2O. So you can just picture the men and women during the ancient times, if this is speaking on God bringing about a drought. You have absolutely nothing, and there's nothing that you can do. What does that do to the pride of man? It crushes it. For you truly see just how small and insignificant you are when God takes that away and you can't even feed your family. One of the very nutrients that you have taken for granted, and you can't even drink a glass of water because it is gone. And we today, we don't even give it a second thought. We go to the house, turn on the tap, go to your fridge, push a button, there's water. Do you ever sit and just say, thank you? Thank you for this water that you have provided. The next time you're in an elevator or on a crowded street, you better be thanking God for water, or you'd be smelling the people next to you all the time. And it truly is. It's the little things that God has provided for us. The ancient times, they took it for granted. They did not thank him. They did not want him. So he takes it. And he can do it again. And without water, it doesn't matter your status in life. If God's not going to provide it, you can't get it. Now look at verse 5. The earth lies defiled under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed the laws, violated the statuses, broken the everlasting covenant. For it's the sinfulness of man, the fall of Adam and Eve, that has cursed the earth. This is what drives me crazy with climate alarmists. I mean, it drives me absolutely insane when we're being told time and time again that the world is going to end because we're destroying it. Now listen, this is what's been given to us. We are to take care of this world, but we're not going to destroy it. We can't. For God has given us this world to use it, to use its natural resources. You think mankind can destroy this world? Not if God doesn't decree it. And we know the end. This world isn't going to be here forever. It is going to be destroyed. Why? Because of man's sin. Now again, we're not going to try and speed up the process, but this is a dying world. You know what I find interesting? You can see the hypocrisy in our leadership, yet a lot of people don't want to talk about it because it's cool to be a climate alarmist right now. What was it recent? The G20 conference, is that right? Do you know how many private jets flew to the G20 conference? Over 400. That's not a carbon footprint. That's Bigfoot's carbon footprint. And we're supposed to listen to these people lecture us on how we can save this world? 400 jets. I don't see anybody taking an Uber, do y'all? Nobody took a boat? No, because it doesn't apply to them. I mean, I don't care if they go or not. I mean, they can fly wherever they want to, but don't tell us how we're crushing this world. They don't understand the scripture. God is the one that is destroying the world. The planet's dying because man worships the planet. Man worships the very planet that God created. Which is why we can see how the eternal covenant has been broken. And I believe this is referring to the Noahic covenant in Genesis 1, verses 9 through 17. And it's in those verses where God speaks out against man killing one another. That is to shed blood of another person. And of course, in its broader reference, it's referring to man following God's command. But yes, man killed man. Man still kills man. And when we look at the commands of God, yes, man broke the commands of God then, and we are still doing it today. Now, what if man did follow the commands of God? In the ancient times, what did God promise? An abundant life. But that's not what happened. So we see during the ancient times, God's wrath being poured out because of man. We'll stop there for this evening. So come back next week and we'll actually get to verse 6. That'll be exciting. But I hope you see what is actually taking place here.